The wind comes down from the Guadarrama Mountains carrying the scent of pine and something older, something mineral and cold, as if the stone itself breathes in the darkness before dawn. It is October in the year 1584, and the first light has not yet touched the eastern face of the structure that rises from this barren plateau like a geometric hallucination. There is no sound but the wind, no bells yet, no footsteps on the endless corridors of granite. In this suspended moment, El Escorial exists in a silence so complete it seems almost sacred, almost peaceful, a monument to devotion, to faith, to the glory of God and the Spanish crown. But silence in this place is deceptive. In the kitchens beneath the monastery wing, servants are already stirring. Coal must be carried, water drawn from the cisterns that honeycomb the basement levels. Bread dough, prepared the night before, must be shaped and set to rise. In the infirmary, monks tend to their aged brothers, changing linens, preparing medicines compounded from herbs grown in the monastery gardens. In the library, a single oil lamp burns where a cataloger has worked through the night, his eyes aching from the close work of copying manuscripts. And somewhere in the private chambers of the royal apartments, in a room deliberately austere, deliberately small, deliberately positioned so that its single window looks directly down into the high altar of the basilica, a man lies awake in his bed, calculating. Philip II, King of Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, and the Low Countries, ruler of territories spanning 4 continents, master of the most powerful empire the world has ever known, cannot sleep. His gout has worsened. The dispatches from the Netherlands bring only frustration. The English Queen continues to evade his diplomatic overtures. And this building, this vast, impossible, magnificent building that has consumed 21 years of his reign and more treasure than he cares to calculate, is finally, impossibly, complete. What rises from the Spanish earth on this autumn morning is not merely a structure. It is a statement carved in granite, a declaration of faith and power and control so absolute that it requires an entire hidden world simply to function. The beauty is undeniable, the cost is incalculable, and the contradiction between what El Escorial presents to the world and what it demands from those who serve it will define its existence for the next 5 centuries. This is the story of that contradiction, of devotion that masked ambition, of grandeur that required degradation, of eternal order maintained only through endless labor. This is the story of the palace that tried to conquer time itself, and the price that victory exacted from every generation that inherited its magnificent burden. To stand before El Escorial for the first time is to experience a carefully calibrated assault on the human sense of scale. The western facade stretches for 207 meters, a continuous wall of gray granite broken only by the rhythmic repetition of windows, 2,600 of them across the entire complex, and the severe geometry of the main entrance. The stone is local, quarried from the mountains that rise behind the structure, and its color shifts throughout the day. Blue-gray in morning shadow, warm gold when the afternoon sun strikes at an angle, almost black under moonlight. The effect is not one of decoration, but of mass, of weight, of permanence so absolute it seems to mock the fragility of human life. The complex covers more than 33,000 square meters of ground. Its footprint is a vast rectangle, 207 meters by 161 meters, subdivided into 16 interior courtyards that admit light and air to the honeycomb of chambers within. The entire structure was designed on a grid, every proportion calculated, every measurement deliberate. Contemporary accounts describe it as resembling a gridiron, the instrument of martyrdom of St. Lawrence, to whom the complex is dedicated, though architectural historians debate whether this was intentional symbolism or coincidental geometry. What is certain is that nothing about El Escorial happened by accident. Every stone, every corridor, every window placement reflects a plan so comprehensive It borders on the obsessive. The numbers alone stagger comprehension. 1,200 doors, 16 courtyards, 86 staircases, 15 cloisters, 88 fountains, though many have long since ceased to flow. The basilica dome rises 92 meters above the floor, visible from miles distant across the barren Meseta. The library contains more than 40,000 volumes and 4,000 manuscripts, including medieval texts of incalculable scholarly value. The art collection, assembled by Philip and his successors, includes works by Titian, El Greco, Velázquez, Hieronymus Bosch, masters whose paintings were selected not merely for aesthetic pleasure, but for theological instruction. And beneath the high altar, in a circular chamber of polished marble accessed by a narrow staircase, lie the remains of nearly every Spanish monarch since Charles V. The pantheon of kings, as it came to be known, was not completed until decades after Philip's death, but it fulfilled his vision of El Escorial as the necropolis of his dynasty. Here, in bronze and marble sarcophagi arranged in concentric tiers, the rulers of Spain sleep in geometrically ordered rows, as methodical in death as Philip wished them to be in life. The visitor who wanders these corridors cannot escape the sensation of being watched, not by guards or servants, though both were always present, but by the architecture itself. Sightlines extend for hundreds of meters. Doorways align with other doorways, creating views that pierce through multiple chambers. Sound carries strangely, bouncing off stone surfaces, making private conversation difficult and whispered conspiracies nearly impossible. This was not coincidence. Philip designed El Escorial as an instrument of surveillance as much as devotion. From his private apartments, he could observe the monks at their prayers without being seen himself. From his council chambers, he could monitor the comings and goings of his ministers. The building was a machine for seeing, and Philip placed himself at the center of its vision. But to understand El Escorial only as a display of power is to miss its deeper complexity. Philip conceived this place not merely as a palace, but as a prototype for heaven, an earthly approximation of divine order imposed through architecture. Every element served multiple purposes. The monastery provided prayers for the souls of the dead, ensuring the salvation of the royal family through perpetual intercession. The library preserved human knowledge as a reflection of divine wisdom. The basilica offered daily masses, connecting the temporal realm to the eternal. The palace provided the administrative center from which an empire could be governed according to Catholic principles. Nothing was extraneous, nothing was decorative without being also functional. In Philip's theology of power, beauty itself was a form of argument, evidence of God's favor made visible in stone. Yet the more complete the vision, the more it demanded for its maintenance. A building this vast does not sustain itself. Behind the granite facades, beneath the inlaid marble floors, within the walls that appeared so seamlessly solid, lay the hidden infrastructure that made El Escorial possible, the veins and arteries through which water, heat, food, and labor flowed to keep the dream alive. The basement levels of El Escorial extend beneath nearly the entire footprint of the complex, a subterranean world that visitors rarely see and that historical accounts often neglect. Here, in perpetual twilight, the practical machinery of grandeur operated around the clock. Water arrived through an elaborate system of channels and cisterns, collected from springs in the mountains and from rainfall directed through the courtyards into underground reservoirs. The capacity of these systems was enormous, tens of thousands of liters stored against the dry summers when the Meseta baked under relentless sun and local streams dwindled to trickles. The supply chain required to feed El Escorial stretched across the kingdom. At its peak of operation, during Philip's reign and those of his immediate successors, the complex housed hundreds of permanent residents, monks, priests, servants, guards, administrators, gardeners, cooks, grooms, physicians, and assorted specialists whose skills kept the institution functioning. Each required food, clothing, and accommodation. The kitchens operated continuously, preparing meals for hierarchies that demanded different diets for different ranks. Monks ate plainly, in accordance with their vows. Royal guests expected the finest the empire could provide. Servants received what was left. Provisioning records from the period reveal the scale of consumption: hundreds of loaves of bread daily, barrels of wine by the score, olive oil in quantities measured by the wagon load. Fish, delivered from the coast by relays of mules traveling through the night so it arrived fresh enough to serve. Spices from the Indies, purchased at enormous expense. Sugar, still a luxury, reserved for the royal household. Ice, cut from the mountain lakes in winter and stored in underground chambers insulated with straw to cool drinks during the scorching summers. Every item represented a transaction, a journey, a negotiation, a payment. The economy of a small town operated within these walls, and the surrounding countryside oriented itself around the monastery's needs. Heating presented particular challenges. The Guadarrama winters could be brutal, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow accumulating in the courtyards for weeks at a time. The primary method of heating was simple: braziers burning charcoal or wood, placed in individual chambers and tended by servants who carried fuel from the basement storerooms. The inefficiency was staggering. Heat rose and dissipated through high ceilings. Cold radiated inward from the granite walls, which seemed to store the chill of winter and release it even into spring. Philip himself suffered terribly from the cold, his gout aggravated by the damp and chill, yet he refused modifications that would compromise the architectural purity of his vision. The physical labor required simply to maintain temperature throughout the complex consumed the efforts of dozens of workers. Wood and charcoal had to be procured, stored, transported, distributed, and replenished. Ash had to be removed. Chimneys, where they existed, had to be swept. The risk of fire was constant, and precautions against it occupied a permanent place in the administrative priorities of the institution. Waste disposal presented its own logistics. Human waste from hundreds of residents had to be collected, transported, and disposed of, a task that fell to the lowest ranks of the servant hierarchy and that left no detailed records because no one wished to dwell on its particulars. Garbage, food scraps, and other refuse required similar handling. The surrounding landscape absorbed what the building expelled, but the scale of waste generated by a community of this size strained even the capacious environment of the meseta. And then there was the maintenance of the building itself, the never-ending battle against entropy that would define El Escorial's existence through every subsequent century. Stone, even granite, weathers. Mortar cracks, lead roofing shifts, and admits water. Wooden beams supporting floors and ceilings expand and contract with temperature changes, eventually warping or splitting. Windows break, plaster falls, painted surfaces fade. A structure of this size generates a continuous stream of repair needs, each individually minor but collectively overwhelming. Philip understood this. He established a permanent maintenance staff and allocated funds specifically for repairs. He created administrative positions responsible for the building's physical condition. He instituted inspections and reporting requirements. But even his formidable attention to detail could not prevent the slow accumulation of deferred maintenance that would become, in later centuries, an existential threat to the building's survival. The hidden infrastructure of El Escorial thus reveals the fundamental paradox of monumental architecture. The greater the building, the greater its appetite for the resources required to sustain it. Philip imagined a structure that would endure for eternity, a stone argument for the permanence of Catholic monarchy. What he actually built was a machine that required perpetual feeding, a beautiful, brilliant, terrible machine that would consume the labor and wealth of generations simply to remain standing. To understand why Philip built what he built, one must understand the man who built it, and that understanding requires patience, for Philip was nothing if not complicated. He was born in 1527, the only surviving son of the Emperor Charles V. and he was raised from infancy to inherit the most extensive empire the world had ever seen. His education was comprehensive and rigorous. He learned Latin, French, Portuguese, and Italian, in addition to his native Castilian. He studied theology under the leading scholars of his age. He received instruction in government, in warfare, in the management of courtly ritual. By the time he was 16, his father entrusted him with the regency of Spain while Charles campaigned in Germany. By 29, Philip was king, inheriting from his abdicating father the crowns of Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and shortly thereafter Portugal and its global empire. The burden was immense, and Philip bore it with a conscientiousness that bordered on neurosis. He believed, truly, devoutly, unshakably believed, that God had placed him on the throne not for his own glorification, but as an instrument of divine will. His duty was to preserve Catholic orthodoxy, to extend Spanish power as a vehicle for the faith, and to govern his subjects according to principles that would ensure their salvation as well as their prosperity. This was not cynical propaganda. Philip's private correspondence reveals a man haunted by the weight of his responsibilities, tormented by the fear of making decisions that would lead souls to damnation. His method of governance reflected this burden. Where his father had traveled constantly, moving from kingdom to kingdom in an endless circuit of personal rule, Philip retreated into paperwork. He read every document himself. He annotated every report. He demanded information, synthesis, analysis, more and more data flowing toward him from every corner of his empire, processed through his own mind, responded to in his own cramped handwriting. The paper mountain grew higher each year, and Philip climbed it daily, working at his desk for 10, 12, 14 hours, squinting at dispatches in the flickering candlelight until his eyes ached and his gout flared. This obsession with information was intimately connected to his obsession with control. Philip trusted no one completely. His ministers were capable, but never autonomous. His generals received detailed instructions that constrained their tactical freedom. His ambassadors reported everything and decided nothing without approval. The empire was vast, but its nervous system ran through a single node, the king himself sitting at his desk, reading, writing, calculating, deciding. El Escorial was the physical manifestation of this personality. Philip did not delegate its design. He worked closely with his architects, approving or rejecting proposals, demanding modifications, supervising progress with the same attention he devoted to state documents. The building was, in a very real sense, an extension of his mind, a three-dimensional expression of his vision of order, permanence, and control. But there was another dimension to Philip's character that El Escorial also embodied, his profound, almost morbid awareness of death. He had watched his first wife, Maria of Portugal, die in childbirth. His second wife, Mary Tudor of England, died of illness after a marriage that produced no surviving children. His third wife, Elizabeth of France, died at 23, possibly from complications of pregnancy. His fourth wife, Anna of Austria, bore him children but suffered frequent miscarriages before her own death at 43. Philip outlived 3 of his sons. He watched his empire creak under pressures he could not fully control: rebellion in the Netherlands, piracy in the Caribbean, religious wars in France, the English threat that would culminate in the disaster of the Armada. Death surrounded Philip. It haunted his correspondence, his prayers, his political calculations, and it shaped El Escorial, which was conceived from the beginning as a mausoleum as much as a palace, a place where Spanish kings would be buried for eternity, where monks would pray perpetually for their souls, where the transience of human life would be set against the permanence of stone and the infinity of divine time. Philip's private apartments within the complex reveal this preoccupation with stark clarity. They are modest by royal standards, small rooms simply furnished, Their walls hung not with tapestries, but with maps and religious paintings. The bedroom is positioned so that its single window looks directly down into the high altar of the basilica. From his bed, in his final years, Philip could watch the monks celebrate Mass. From his deathbed, he could receive the Eucharist without leaving his chamber. The architecture eliminated the boundary between living and dying, between the king's private existence and his public role as defender of the faith. This was not an accident. It was a statement. Philip designed his life's end as carefully as he designed his building, and when death came at last in 1598, he met it with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his entire existence. He spent his final weeks in confession, in prayer, in dictating instructions for the governance of the kingdom after his passing. He ordered his coffin placed in his bedroom so he could contemplate it while he still breathed. He died, according to witnesses, with profound composure, his gaze fixed on a crucifix held before his failing eyes. The building survived him, as he intended. The man who conceived it as an instrument of eternal control passed into the very mausoleum he had created, joining the generations of monarchs whose remains would accumulate in the pantheon beneath the altar. But the machine he built still required maintenance. The vision he imposed still demanded resources, and the empire he governed was already beginning to fray. The construction of El Escorial consumed 21 years, the labor of thousands, and resources drawn from across the Spanish Empire and beyond. Understanding how the building rose from the barren plateau is essential to understanding its subsequent history. For the patterns established during construction, the massive mobilization of labor, the relentless demand for materials, the integration of local and imperial resources, would continue to shape the building's relationship with its surrounding world for centuries. Work began in 1563, 2 years after Philip selected the site. The location was deliberate. The Meseta, the high central plateau of Spain, offered a climate Philip found therapeutic, cooler in summer than Madrid, dry rather than humid. The nearby mountains provided building stone, timber, and water. The distance from the capital, roughly 45 kilometers, was sufficient to allow retreat from court politics, while remaining close enough for effective governance. The site itself was barren, windswept, almost inhospitable, precisely the character of austere devotion Philip wished to project. The first architect was Juan Bautista de Toledo, an Italian-trained Spaniard who had worked on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He prepared the initial designs in consultation with Philip, establishing the grid-like plan and the integration of palace, monastery, and church into a single unified complex. But Juan Bautista died in 1567, only 4 years into the project, and the completion of his vision fell to his assistant and successor, Juan de Herrera. Herrera would become the dominant figure in the building's design, refining and simplifying Juan Bautista's plans, eliminating ornamental elements in favor of the severe geometric purity that defines El Escorial's exterior. The style that emerged, later called Herrerian in his honor, represented a deliberate rejection of the florid Renaissance decoration popular elsewhere in Europe. Surfaces were left plain, moldings were minimal. The effect was one of disciplined austerity, a visual manifestation of the Counter-Reformation's insistence on spiritual substance over material display. The workforce varied enormously over the construction period, expanding during periods of intense activity and contracting during winters or when funds ran short. At peak employment, several thousand workers might be present on the site simultaneously. They included stonecutters and masons who shaped the granite blocks, carpenters who built scaffolding and interior structures, laborers who transported materials and performed unskilled tasks, specialized craftsmen who handled ironwork, glassmaking, and decorative elements. Many were local, recruited from villages in the surrounding region. Others were brought from elsewhere in Spain. Some were foreign specialists, Italian engineers, Flemish painters, German metal workers, whose expertise justified their premium wages. The granite came primarily from quarries in the nearby mountains. some within sight of the building site. But extraction and transport of stone on this scale required infrastructure that did not previously exist. Roads were constructed to accommodate the heavy wagons that carried blocks weighing tons from quarry to site. Ox teams were purchased and maintained. Workshops were established for the preliminary shaping of stone before it left the quarry, reducing transport weight. The logistics were extraordinary. A continuous flow of material from mountain to site, sustained across 2 decades of construction. Other materials came from farther afield. Timber for scaffolding, roof structures, and interior woodwork arrived from the forests of northern Spain, requiring complex supply chains that extended hundreds of kilometers. Iron for hinges, nails, and structural reinforcement came from the Basque Country, where centuries of mining had established specialized industries. Lead for roofing was imported from multiple sources. Marble for decorative elements, columns, floors, the elaborate tombs came from quarries throughout Spain and from Italy. The financial cost is impossible to calculate precisely, as records are incomplete and accounting practices of the era differed from modern standards. Contemporary estimates ranged from 3 to 6 million ducats for the primary construction, sums that represented a significant fraction of the Spanish crown's annual revenues. These figures excluded many associated costs: the acquisition of art, the furnishing of chambers, the establishment of the monastery's endowments, the ongoing expenses of operation that began even before construction was complete. Where did the money come from? Primarily from the treasure fleets that crossed the Atlantic, carrying silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico. The Spanish Empire of the 16th century enjoyed access to precious metals on a scale unprecedented in human history, and El Escorial was built with silver extracted from American mountains by indigenous and enslaved laborers working in conditions of appalling brutality. The granite blocks of the monastery are, in this sense, transmuted silver, and that silver was, in turn, transmuted human suffering. The beauty of El Escorial cannot be fully appreciated without acknowledging the hidden foundations of exploitation upon which it rested. The laborers on site faced their own hardships, though of a different order. Construction work in the 16th century was dangerous. Falls from scaffolding, injuries from tools and falling materials, and occupational diseases were common. Workers lived in temporary camps near the site, enduring conditions that would be considered intolerable by modern standards. Their wages were often paid irregularly, delayed by the chronic cash flow problems that plagued the Spanish treasury. Strikes and work stoppages were not unknown. The human cost of construction, like the financial cost, exceeded what any official record fully captured. And yet the building rose. Year by year, wall by wall, the monastery took shape against the sky. By 1574, the monastery was sufficiently complete for monks to take up residence. By 1582, Philip was able to occupy his royal apartments. The basilica was consecrated in 1586. Work continued on interior decoration and refinement for years thereafter, but the essential structure was complete within the time frame Philip had demanded. The achievement was genuine. To construct a building of this size and complexity in 21 years, using 16th century technology, represented organizational capabilities as impressive as the architectural vision itself. Philip's bureaucratic methods, his insistence on documentation, his attention to detail, his systematic approach to problem-solving, translated into effective project management. The building was not merely a monument to his piety or his power. It was a demonstration of his administrative philosophy made manifest in stone. The completion of construction did not end El Escorial's financial demands. On the contrary, the operational costs of the complex would prove relentless, decade after decade, century after century, a burden that each successive generation inherited and struggled to sustain. At its institutional peak, El Escorial housed a community of approximately 200 monks of the Order of St. Jerome, the Hieronymites, whom Philip had selected to serve as the building's permanent religious inhabitants. The Hieronymites brought with them a tradition of contemplative monasticism, elaborate liturgical observance, and scholarly activity that suited Philip's vision of El Escorial as a center of spiritual and intellectual life. Their daily rounds of prayer, the canonical hours that structured monasteries throughout Europe, filled the basilica with chanting from before dawn until after dusk. But 200 monks required support. Each had to be fed, clothed, housed, and provided with the materials necessary for religious observance. The monastery possessed extensive landholdings accumulated through royal grants and other benefactions which provided income and agricultural produce. Tenant farmers worked these lands, paying rents in cash or kind that flowed into the monastery's treasury. Estates scattered across Spain, vineyards, olive groves, wheat fields, pastures for livestock, constituted the economic foundation that made the religious community viable. In addition to the monks, the monastery employed substantial numbers of lay servants who performed tasks that monastic rule did not allow the brothers to undertake. Cooks, cleaners, gardeners, stable hands, maintenance workers, and administrators formed a parallel community that outnumbered the monks themselves. Their wages represented a continuous outflow of funds that the monastery's endowments had to cover. The royal household added further complexity. Although Philip and his successors did not reside permanently at El Escorial, their visits required extensive preparation and staffing. Royal kitchens operated separately from the monastic facilities. Royal servants maintained the apartments in constant readiness. Guards secured the perimeters. The costs of these functions fell partly on the crown and partly on the monastery, in arrangements that varied over time and that generated periodic disputes about financial responsibility. Contemporary records suggest annual operating costs in the range of 60 to 80,000 ducats during the reigns of Philip and his immediate successors, sums that exceeded the income available from the monastery's endowments and required supplementary funding from the crown. The deficit was structural, built into the institution from its founding. Philip had created something that cost more to run than it could independently sustain, and his successors inherited the bill. Maintenance consumed an especially significant share of these costs. The lead roofing required regular inspection and repair to prevent leaks that would damage the structure below. The extensive glazing, those thousands of windows, suffered breakage from weather and accident that required continuous replacement. Stone surfaces needed cleaning and occasionally repointing. Wooden elements decayed and required renewal. The fountains, dependent on aging water supply systems, broke down with increasing frequency. Each year brought its own catalog of repair needs, and each year the decision had to be made anew about which repairs to prioritize and which to defer. The household accounts from this period reveal the granular reality of these costs. Payments to glaziers for replacing broken panes, payments to masons for repairing cracked steps, payments for lime and sand and iron fittings, payments for ropes and pulleys and scaffolding timber. The sums were individually modest but collectively enormous, a slow hemorrhage of resources that even the wealthiest institution could not ignore indefinitely. Fuel consumption represented another major expense. The charcoal and wood required for heating, cooking, and the various artisanal activities associated with the monastery had to be purchased, transported, and stored. Forests in the surrounding region were systematically harvested to supply these needs, and as local supplies were exhausted, fuel had to be brought from greater distances at higher cost. The environmental footprint of El Escorial extended far beyond its physical boundaries, reshaping the landscape of central Spain to feed its perpetual appetite for combustible materials. The fundamental problem was one of mismatch between aspiration and resources. Philip had built for eternity, but eternity does not pay bills. His successors would grapple with this reality in ways that gradually transformed the institution he had created, adapting it to survive in circumstances he had not anticipated. The The first great crisis came not from within, but from without, the slow but inexorable decline of Spanish power that would transform the 17th century into an extended exercise in imperial retreat. The roots of decline predated El Escorial's completion. Philip's reign, for all its territorial extent, was marked by financial crises that forced multiple declarations of state bankruptcy. The treasure from the Americas, vast as it was, could not cover the costs of continuous warfare in the Netherlands, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic. Debts accumulated. Creditors grew wary. The famous Armada of 1588, which Philip launched against England just 4 years after El Escorial's completion, ended in disaster, not merely a military defeat, but a symbolic announcement that Spanish power had limits. Philip III, who succeeded his father in 1598, was a weaker ruler in every sense. He delegated governance to favorites, reduced his engagement with the paperwork that had consumed his father's days, and allowed the bureaucratic machinery of empire to coast rather than driving it. Under his reign, the flow of American silver began to slow as the most accessible deposits were exhausted and colonial administration became increasingly corrupt. Revenues declined. Debts remained. For El Escorial, the immediate effects were subtle but cumulative. The Crown's contributions to the monastery's operations became less reliable. Payments were delayed, then reduced, then occasionally skipped entirely. The monks petitioned for arrears. The royal household's visits became less frequent, reducing the ceremonial role that had justified much of the institution's expense. The maintenance backlog grew. Philip IV, who reigned from 1621 to 1665, faced even more severe pressures. During his reign, Portugal broke away from the Spanish crown, taking with it the colonial revenues that had helped sustain imperial finances. Catalonia revolted. The 30 Years' War drained resources into continental conflicts that brought Spain no lasting advantage. By mid-century, the empire was contracting on multiple fronts, and the wealth that had once seemed inexhaustible was visibly diminishing. At El Escorial, the effects were now impossible to ignore. Repairs that would once have been routine were deferred. Staff levels declined as positions went unfilled after their holders died or departed. The quality of provisions fell. The monks, accustomed to a certain standard of living, complained of deprivation. The royal apartments rarely used began to show signs of neglect. The physical structure, barely a century old, was already aging faster than maintenance could address. Water infiltration from the leaking roofs had damaged interior surfaces. Some of the lead roofing, improperly installed or subsequently neglected, was failing entirely. The elaborate hydraulic systems that supplied the fountains and cisterns were breaking down, and the expertise required to repair them was becoming scarce. The library, Philip's pride, suffered from inadequate environmental controls that threatened the preservation of its manuscripts. Most telling was the shift in the monastery's economic relationship with its surrounding territories. The lands that had once provided income were now sources of conflict. Tenants struggled to pay rents. Disputes over boundaries and rights consumed administrative energy. Some properties were sold to raise immediate cash, reducing the endowment that was supposed to provide permanent support. The institution was eating its own seed corn. By the time Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died in 1700, El Escorial had survived its first century but was showing the strain. The new Bourbon dynasty that followed would bring different approaches and different crises, but the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. The building existed on a scale that exceeded any sustainable revenue base, and every generation would have to find new ways to bridge the gap. The 18th century brought renovation and, in some ways, renewed attention to El Escorial's physical condition, but also new forms of transformation that would have horrified Philip II. The Bourbon kings who replaced the Habsburgs after the War of Spanish Succession were French in origin and orientation. They brought with them different aesthetic sensibilities, different administrative methods, and different relationships with the Catholic Church. While they maintained El Escorial as a royal site and continued to support the monastery, their priorities differed from those of Philip and his immediate successors. Charles III, who reigned from 1759 to 1788, was perhaps the most consequential of the Bourbon monarchs for El Escorial's physical history. An enthusiast for Enlightenment ideas and pragmatic reform, he invested substantially in improvements to the building and its surroundings. Roads were upgraded to improve access from Madrid. The town of San Lorenzo, which had grown up to serve the monastery, was replanned and expanded. Architectural modifications aimed to make the royal apartments more comfortable for extended residence. Some of these modifications addressed genuinely urgent needs. A major fire in 1771 destroyed portions of the complex, including parts of the library and significant architectural elements. The reconstruction that followed incorporated improvements in fire safety and structural stability, while generally respecting the original design vocabulary. But the fire itself demonstrated the perpetual vulnerability of even the most massive stone structures to catastrophic damage, and the enormous expense of restoration afterward. The Bourbon approach to religion also affected the monastery. The Spanish crown's relationship with the church was evolving, influenced by Enlightenment critiques of ecclesiastical wealth and power. The Hieronymite order itself was declining, its recruitment falling, and its relevance increasingly questioned. While the monks remained at El Escorial, their numbers diminished, and their role in the institution's life became more limited. More dramatically, the crown began to extract value from the monastery's accumulated treasures. Artworks were removed to stock the newly established Prado Museum in Madrid. Manuscripts were transferred to the Royal Library. The process was gradual but significant, a dispersal of the collections that Philip had assembled to glorify his creation. El Escorial remained magnificent, but some of its magnificence was being relocated to serve other purposes. The 19th century brought still more radical disruption. Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 unleashed forces that would transform the institution more fundamentally than anything since its founding. French troops occupied El Escorial, using it as barracks and headquarters. Damage was inflicted on the building and its contents, some from deliberate vandalism, some from the simple carelessness of military occupation. The Hieronymite community was dispersed, its members fleeing or being expelled as the conflict swept across Spain. The monastery never fully recovered its former role. The liberal governments that emerged after Spain's long struggle for independence from French control pursued policies of ecclesiastical disentailment, the confiscation and sale of church property to address state debts and promote economic development. The monastic orders were suppressed. Their lands were sold to private buyers. The economic foundation that had sustained El Escorial for centuries was dismantled in a matter of years. What remained was the building itself, still crown property, still architecturally intact, but stripped of its institutional reason for existence. The monks were gone. The endless cycle of prayer that had animated the basilica for generations had ceased. The kitchens that had fed hundreds now stood cold. The cells that had housed contemplatives were empty. Philip had built El Escorial as an eternal machine for salvation, a perpetual motion device of prayer and devotion that would operate forever. In less than 3 centuries, that machine had been shut down. The remainder of the 19th century and the early 20th century saw El Escorial drift through a kind of institutional limbo. Too magnificent to abandon, too expensive to maintain, too significant to transform into something entirely different. Various uses were proposed and sometimes implemented. Educational institutions occupied portions of the complex. The Augustinian order was eventually invited to establish a presence, taking over some of the functions that the Hieronymites had once performed, though with far fewer monks and a considerably reduced scope of activity. The royal apartments were preserved as ceremonial spaces for occasional use by the crown, but Spain's 19th century political instability meant that no consistent pattern of royal residence was established. The pantheon of kings continued to receive royal remains, maintaining at least one aspect of Philip's original vision. New sarcophagi were added as monarchs died, the circular chamber gradually filling with its geometric cargo of dead rulers. The symbolism remained potent, but the perpetual prayers that were supposed to accompany royal interment had been interrupted, reduced, and ultimately transformed into something more formal and less continuous. Maintenance during this period was chronically underfunded. The building that had absorbed the wealth of an empire now received what a struggling Spanish state could spare, which was rarely enough. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, paint flaked from ceilings. The gardens that had once been meticulously tended grew wild or were simplified to reduce upkeep costs. The fountains, most of them, no longer functioned. The infrastructure that Philip had created for perpetual care was itself decaying. Photography from the late 19th and early 20th centuries documents the condition of the complex during this period. The stone facades remained impressive, granite is durable, but the details revealed neglect. Windows were broken or boarded, courtyards were cluttered with storage. The interior spaces were maintained, showed the accumulated effects of improvised repairs and inadequate climate control. The library's humidity fluctuated in ways that threatened the manuscripts. The paintings suffered from inadequate cleaning and conservation. What prevented complete collapse was the building's unique status as a symbol of Spanish identity. El Escorial had become, over the centuries, more than a royal palace or a defunct monastery. It had become a monument, a representation of Spain's imperial past, a reminder of the era when Spanish power had girdled the globe. Nationalist sentiment, whether of liberal or conservative flavor, invested the building with meanings that transcended its practical utility. This symbolic importance would prove essential to its survival. When practical arguments for investment failed, symbolic arguments sometimes succeeded. El Escorial was too important to lose, even if its importance was more abstract than concrete, more emotional than economic. The 20th century brought new crises and, eventually, new solutions, though the solutions came with their own complications and compromises. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 inflicted relatively limited direct damage on El Escorial, which lay in nationalist-controlled territory for most of the conflict. But the war devastated the Spanish economy and left the country isolated and impoverished for decades. Under Francisco Franco's dictatorship, El Escorial was appropriated as a symbol of Catholic nationalism, the very values Philip had sought to embody made explicit in the regime's propaganda. Franco himself would eventually choose a site nearby for his own controversial monument, the Valley of the Fallen, which drew on El Escorial's architectural vocabulary while adding meanings specific to the Civil War and its aftermath. The institutional relationship between El Escorial and the Spanish state was formalized during this period. The complex was designated as national heritage, its maintenance explicitly a public responsibility. A permanent staff of conservators, curators, and administrators was established, their salaries paid by the state. Regular budgets were allocated for repairs and preservation work. The chaotic improvisation of earlier decades gave way to systematic management, though the budgets were never sufficient, and the backlog of deferred maintenance never fully addressed. Tourism emerged as both a problem and an opportunity. The building had attracted visitors since shortly after its completion. Curious travelers, religious pilgrims, foreign diplomats, and eventually ordinary tourists seeking to experience one of Europe's most remarkable structures. But tourism on a modern scale, with tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of annual visitors, presented challenges that Philip had never imagined. Foot traffic wore its stone floors. The carbon dioxide from thousands of breathing visitors affected the climate within enclosed spaces. Vibrations from walking stressed the structural elements beneath. The logistical requirements of managing visitor flows, ticketing, crowd control, security, sanitation, demanded resources and attention that had to be balanced against conservation priorities. Yet, tourism also brought revenue. Entry fees, while never covering the full costs of maintenance and operation, contributed meaningfully to the institution's budget. Gift shops, guidebooks, and associated services generated additional income. The cultural capital of El Escorial's fame could be to some extent monetized. The tension between access and preservation would define the latter half of the 20th century and continues to define the present. Every visitor who walks through Philip's corridors contributes infinitesimally but cumulatively to the where that conservators must address. Every breath of humid air exhaled into the library threatens the manuscripts that survive there. Every photograph taken with a flash accelerates the fading of painted surfaces. Yet, closing the building would mean abandoning the public mission that justifies its continued existence and cutting off the revenue stream that helps pay for its care. The establishment of Spanish democracy after Franco's death in 1975 brought new frameworks for managing El Escorial and new resources, particularly after Spain's entry into the European Community in 1986. UNESCO's designation of El Escorial as a World Heritage Site in 1984 represented international recognition of its significance and brought with it access to expertise and, occasionally, funding from international sources. The designation also imposed obligations, reporting requirements, compliance with international conservation standards, integration into a global framework of heritage management that connected El Escorial to sites as distant as the pyramids and the Great Wall. The decades since have seen substantial investment in conservation and restoration. Major projects have addressed the roofing systems, replacing deteriorated lead with new materials where necessary and repairing the underlying structures that had suffered from centuries of water infiltration. The library has received modern climate control systems designed to stabilize the temperature and humidity that affect the survival of its collections. Paintings have been cleaned and restored, stonework has been repointed, gardens have been replanted according to historical documentation. The current staffing of El Escorial includes approximately 100 permanent employees, a mix of administrators, conservators, security personnel, guides, and maintenance workers. This number is supplemented by contractors brought in for specific projects, and by the remaining Augustinian community, which numbers only a handful of friars, but maintains the religious observances that connect the present to the past. The operating budget, drawing on state allocations, tourism revenue, and various supplementary sources, runs into the millions of euros annually. Yet even this level of investment falls short of what ideal conservation practice would require. The backlog of deferred maintenance, reduced but never eliminated, continues to generate emergencies that compete for priority. Every euro spent on one repair is a euro not spent on another. The building's heating remains a particular challenge. Modern systems have been installed in portions of the complex, but the architectural integrity of the structure limits what modifications are possible. Visitors on winter days still feel the chill that penetrated Philip's bones, though they experience it for hours rather than months. The energy consumption of heating even partially effective systems is substantial, and the carbon footprint of El Escorial's climate control raises questions that 16th-century builders never contemplated. Electricity, distributed through wiring that snakes through walls and ceilings in ways that would appall a fire marshal, powers the lighting, security systems, climate control, and administrative functions without which modern operation would be impossible. Upgrading this infrastructure to contemporary safety standards while respecting the historical fabric of the building represents an ongoing challenge, one that current management addresses incrementally, project by project, as resources allow. The water supply systems that Philip installed have been largely superseded by connections to municipal utilities, though some of the original cisterns still function as emergency backup. Waste disposal has been thoroughly modernized. The hidden infrastructure that once required armies of servants now operates largely through mechanical and electronic systems, but those systems themselves require maintenance, updating, and eventual replacement. What then does El Escorial cost today, and who pays? The precise figures fluctuate annually, but rough estimates suggest total expenditure in the range of 10 to 15 million euros per year when all sources, direct state allocations, tourism revenue, special project funding, European Union grants are considered. This sum covers staff salaries, routine maintenance, conservation work, administrative operations, and the security measures essential for protecting both the building and its contents. Approximately 3 to 4 million euros derive from tourism revenue, entry fees, gift shop sales, special events, and related commercial activities. This represents a significant but minority share of total costs. The remainder comes from the Spanish state and, to a lesser extent, from regional governments and international sources. The visitor count in recent years has approached 500,000 annually, though this figure dropped dramatically during the pandemic and has only gradually recovered. Each visitor pays an entry fee that varies depending on the scope of their tour, basic access versus guided tours versus special exhibitions. The economics are straightforward. More visitors mean more revenue, but also more wear and higher operating costs. The relationship between visitor numbers and net financial benefit is not linear. Beyond the quantifiable costs lie the intangibles. The expertise required to conserve a building of this age and complexity is not commonly available. Training conservators, maintaining institutional knowledge across generations, preserving the skills needed for traditional craftsmanship, these represent investments that cannot be captured in a budget line, but that are essential to the building's long-term survival. And there are the opportunity costs. The land occupied by El Escorial and its surrounding grounds could, in theory, be developed for other purposes. The capital locked up in the building's existence could, in theory, be redirected. These are not realistic options. The site's heritage status makes such transformations inconceivable. But they remind us that preservation is always a choice, and choices always carry costs. The present-day visitor to El Escorial encounters a building that has been stabilized but never fully restored, a monument that functions as a museum, a tourist destination, a limited religious community, and a symbol, but that exists in a state of permanent tension between its past grandeur and its present reality. The approach remains impressive. The granite walls still rise with geometric precision. The western facade still dominates the landscape. The interior still offers glimpses of the vision Philip imposed. The endless corridors, the hierarchical spatial relationships, the integration of sacred and secular spaces that made this building unique. But the attentive visitor notices the compromises. Modern lighting fixtures, designed to be unobtrusive but unavoidably present, illuminate chambers that Philip intended to be lit by candles. Emergency exit signs glow in colors that disrupt carefully calculated color schemes. Rope barriers. Channel visitor flows along predetermined paths, preventing access to areas too fragile for traffic. The silence that Philip sought is interrupted by the murmur of tour groups, the click of camera shutters, even where prohibited, and the distant hum of climate control systems. The library, perhaps the most spectacular of the surviving spaces, can be viewed but not accessed by ordinary visitors. The precious volumes that line its walls are visible behind protective barriers, their spines facing outward to display their bindings. Scholars who wish to consult the manuscripts must apply for special permission and work under supervision designed to minimize the risk of damage. The collection that was meant to embody universal knowledge now serves as a display rather than a working library. The Pantheon of Kings, accessible via a narrow staircase that descends beneath the high altar, presents its rows of sarcophagi with an almost clinical regularity. The remains of monarchs from Charles V to Alfonso XIII lie in identical coffins arranged on identical shelves, their individual identities dissolved into the uniformity of dynasty. Visitors file past in near silence, the cool air and the weight of stone combining to produce a solemnity that even the most irreverent tourist tends to respect. The basilica still functions as a religious space, with occasional masses celebrated by the Augustinian community. But the congregation is small, the music modest, compared to the elaborate polyphony that once filled the dome, and the ritual observance that Philip intended to be perpetual has become intermittent. The monks who remain lead lives of genuine devotion, but their numbers cannot sustain the round-the-clock prayer schedule that the Hieronymites once maintained. In the courtyards, where fountains once played, dry basins surrounded by geometric plantings offer aesthetic pleasure but no sound of moving water. The gardens, partially restored according to historical documentation, present an approximation of 16th century design, but lack the army of gardeners who once maintained every hedge and border to Philip's exacting standards. Nature, constrained by geometry for 4 centuries, has been allowed to soften slightly. A few stray plants where none were intended, a certain informality that would have scandalized the original designers. What survives at El Escorial is not what Philip built exactly, but what his building has become after 5 centuries of adaptation, compromise, and continuous negotiation between aspiration and reality. The stone remains. The structure stands. The essential relationships of space and proportion that define the architectural experience are intact. In this sense, the building has fulfilled Philip's intention to create something permanent, something that would outlast his own mortality and the mortality of everyone who came after. But the institution that animated the building, the perpetual machine of prayer and governance, of control and salvation that Philip designed, has been dismantled and reconstructed so many times that its original purpose is now more historical memory than living reality. The monks who pray in the basilica are not Hieronymites, but Augustinians, and their community is a fraction of what Philip envisioned. The administrative functions that once ran an empire from these corridors have been relocated to Madrid, to Brussels, to nowhere in particular. The king himself no longer governs from anywhere, constitutional monarchy having reduced the Spanish crown to ceremonial functions that require no granite machinery to perform. What remains is the building as object, as monument, as museum, as heritage site, as tourist destination, as symbol. Its function now is to be visited, to be photographed, to be experienced as a connection to a past that can never be recovered, but that continues to exert its pull on the present. The building has become its own meaning, a representation of itself and what it once represented. This is a form of survival, but it is also a form of transformation. The El Escorial that Philip built was never meant to be merely seen. It was meant to be used, to house a community, to conduct the business of empire, to perpetuate the prayers that would ensure salvation, to dominate and to serve and to endure as a functioning organism. The El Escorial of today is a specimen preserved in formaldehyde, beautiful still, structurally intact, but no longer alive in the sense its creator intended. And so we return to the question with which we began. How does a building so vast, so demanding, so fundamentally mismatched with any sustainable resource base manage to survive across centuries? The answer is not romantic. It is not a story of love conquering all obstacles or of timeless beauty commanding perpetual devotion. It is a story of compromises made, functions changed, resources scraped together, priorities constantly renegotiated. El Escorial survives because each generation found reasons to preserve it, and those reasons changed with each generation. Philip's successors preserved it because it was their inheritance, their family monument, the physical embodiment of their dynasty's claims to divine favor. The Bourbons preserved it because they inherited the Habsburgs' legacy along with their thrones, and because the building had become inseparable from Spanish identity. The 19th century governments preserved it because even in their anti-clerical and economically desperate moments, they could not bring themselves to abandon something so undeniably magnificent. The 20th century dictators preserved it because it served their propaganda needs. The Democrats preserved it because it had become heritage. And heritage, in the modern world, is something that civilized nations are supposed to protect. At each stage, preservation required adaptation. The monastery became a museum. The palace became a historical exhibit. The mausoleum became a tourist attraction. The library became an archive. The living organism became a specimen. The changes were necessary precisely because the original organism could not survive. Its operating costs exceeded what any subsequent era was willing or able to pay. Its institutional requirements conflicted with changing religious and political circumstances. Its very scale made continuation in the original form impossible. What Philip built was designed to be eternal, but eternity requires infinite resources or infinite flexibility. The resources were never infinite. The flexibility was found only through transformation. The deeper lesson lies in understanding what Philip was actually trying to achieve, and why his vision necessarily carried the seeds of its own unsustainability. Philip sought control over death, over time, over disorder, over the contingencies of human existence that threaten even the most powerful rulers. The building was his answer to mortality. If he could not live forever, he could at least create something that would outlast him, that would continue to function according to his design, long after his body joined those of his ancestors in the pantheon beneath the altar. But the desire for control through architecture is ultimately self-defeating. Buildings do not control the future. They are controlled by it. Every generation that inherits a monumental structure makes its own decisions about how to use, adapt, maintain, or neglect what it has received. Philip could not bind his successors to his vision any more than his predecessors could bind him. The building that expresses perfect order at the moment of its completion immediately begins to generate the disorder of aging, the entropy of systems that no longer function as designed, the inevitable gap between intention and reality. Philip's Escorial was, in this sense, an attempt to stop time, to freeze a particular moment of Spanish power and Catholic order into permanent form. But time does not stop for granite any more than it stops for flesh. The building that was meant to embody permanence has survived precisely by being impermanent, by changing, adapting, accepting modifications that its creator would have found intolerable. The survival is real, but it is not the survival Philip imagined. Perhaps the most honest way to understand El Escorial is as a very expensive and very beautiful argument about what matters. Philip argued through stone and organization and relentless expenditure that order, faith, hierarchy, and permanence were the values that deserved the investment of human effort on this scale. He built a machine for producing those values, and he was willing to spend whatever was necessary, to extract whatever was necessary from whomever could be compelled to contribute, to make that machine function. Later generations have accepted the inheritance but rejected the argument. They maintain the building, not because they share Philip's theology of power, but because they find value in the building itself. Aesthetic value, historical value, cultural value, even economic value as a tourist attraction. The machine has been preserved even as its original purpose has been abandoned. This is not necessarily wrong. Purposes change, values evolve. The reasons for preserving things need not be the reasons for creating them. But there is something instructive in the gap between what Philip intended and what his building has become. A reminder that monumental architecture always outlives its creator's ideologies, and that the meanings we attach to buildings are always provisional, always subject to revision. El Escorial today is a monument to Spanish history, to Renaissance architecture, to the Counter-Reformation, to the 16th century synthesis of power and faith that shaped early modern Europe. It is no longer a functioning instrument of royal control or ecclesiastical salvation. The transition from instrument to monument represents a fundamental change in what the building is, even though the physical fabric remains largely intact. Future generations will attach their own meanings, make their own decisions about investment and preservation, find their own reasons to care or not care about the granite walls rising from the Meseta. The building's survival depends on those decisions, on continuous acts of will by people who do not yet exist, whose values we cannot predict. The sun is setting over the Guadarrama Mountains, and the western facade of El Escorial catches the last light in a way that transforms the gray granite into something like gold. For a few minutes, the building glows as if lit from within, its severity softened by the warmth of the dying day. The tourists have gone, the gift shops have closed, the guides have finished their last tours. Only the maintenance staff remain, beginning the evening rounds that will check the security systems, verify the climate controls, note the small damages that accumulate each day and must be addressed. In the basilica, a single monk prepares for evening prayer. His voice will echo in the vast space, thin and solitary, a remnant of the choral fullness that once filled this building from dawn to dusk. The candles he lights are electric now, controlled by switches rather than flame, but the ritual they enable is continuous with rituals performed here for nearly 5 centuries. Somewhere in the bowels of the building, a conservator reviews the day's photographs of a section of painted ceiling, noting the new cracks that have appeared since the last inspection, calculating the cost of stabilization against the budget that remains. Somewhere in an office in Madrid, an administrator contemplates the revenue projections for the coming year, the visitor numbers that must be maintained, the grant applications that might unlock additional funding. Somewhere in a university library, a scholar examines a document from Philip's reign, trying to understand how a man could have believed so completely in the possibility of ordering the world through architecture. And the building endures. Not because it is indestructible, not because some cosmic justice rewards beauty with preservation, but because human beings continue to make the choice, day after day, year after year, generation after generation, to do the work that survival requires. This is the truth that El Escorial teaches beneath all its grandeur and all its history, that nothing endures by itself. Everything that persists does so because someone maintained it. Every stone that stands does so because someone prevented it from falling. The beauty we inherit is not a gift but a responsibility, and the choice to accept that responsibility is made anew each day in small decisions about budgets and repairs and priorities that collectively determine whether the next generation will inherit what we ourselves received. Philip tried to create something that would endure forever. He succeeded only in creating something that would endure for as long as others chose to preserve it. The difference is everything. Night falls over the Meseta. The granite walls fade from gold to gray to black, visible now only as an absence against the stars. The wind comes down from the mountains again, colder now, carrying the scent of the coming winter. Inside the building, the heating systems struggle against the chill, their modern mechanisms doing imperfectly what braziers and servants once did worse. Tomorrow, the visitors will return. The doors will open. The ritual of preservation will continue. The careful balancing of access and protection, the endless negotiation between past and present, the daily effort to keep standing what time and nature and human indifference would otherwise allow to fall. El Escorial will survive another day, but only because someone made it happen. If the preservation of great beauty always requires continuous sacrifice, labor, and compromise, if nothing truly endures without perpetual effort, what obligations, if any, do we owe to the monuments we inherit, and at what point does the cost of their survival exceed what can justly be demanded of those who come after?